Great. Well, thank you, Roger. So, hey, good morning, everybody. It's good to see everyone. I see everybody looks like their kind of eyes are open and animated. So, Roger, thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about hydrogen. And what I want to do today is really talk about hydrogen at a high level, but also bring home this point of why geology matters for hydrogen and thinking about hydrogen as part of a future decarbonized or lower carbon economy. So with that, let me go ahead and get in. The objectives really are to introduce the opportunity. And so I'm going to talk a little bit, as I mentioned, high level about how hydrogen is used, how it's produced, et cetera. Then we'll delve into some of the specifics of the geological aspects of hydrogen. Where does geology fit with the hydrogen economy? And then in doing so, talk about some of the research opportunities and value chains, and then touch on some novel concepts with hydrogen. So as Roger mentioned, this work, or part of this work at least, is funded by our work at the Bureau of Economic Geology in this consortium. It's called GeoH2. And we have a number of international oil companies. We've got EDF. We have the U.S. Department of Energy involved in this research. And the main focus is to really address this question of scaling up hydrogen with regards to geological storage, techno-economics and value chain analysis, and explore some novel concepts, including, and I'll show one slide on this, on in situ generation of hydrogen. So we've got a large team. None of these folks are working full-time on hydrogen. We've added a couple more faces since then, some postdocs. So for those that are finishing up, PhDs, whatever, looking for research opportunities, please have a chat with me. I'd love to speak with you about research we're doing. And the intent with this team is to basically have a broad range of capabilities, stretching from reservoir engineering to geological reservoir characterization, geophysics, geochemistry, you name it, and as importantly also the economics that are associated with storage. So I don't know how you folks are keeping track, or if you are keeping track of hydrogen in the news and what's happening with announcements from U.S. Department of Energy or others. But go on to Google today, have a look. It's in the news every day. And there's just an enormous amount of new investments, new ideas that are being put forward with regards to developing hydrogen as a energy carrier for a decarbonized economy. And so, there's examples here with the DOE in particular. They've just put forward through the Infrastructure Act, basically a plan to move with a hub scheme where they'll invest $8 billion for 4 regional hubs across the U.S. to try to jumpstart development of hydrogen in these hubs. And so in addition to that, there's another $1.5 billion that the DOE is putting forward for research on hydrogen. And then all kinds of commercial schemes, which are really important because these are where we're going to get traction. And this is how, if hydrogen moves forward, it'll be done by these commercial entities. So lots and lots of activity, both in the US, probably more so in Europe and elsewhere in the globe, but still a lot of activity. So just some basics on hydrogen. I'm not going to delve into a lot of the details here, but it just kind of sets the stage for understanding some of the challenges associated with hydrogen. So it's the most abundant element in the universe, and it's found on Earth in seeps and volcanoes, et cetera. It is, as a gas, colorless, odorless, tasteless, and it also has a very high flammability range. So and we'll get to some of these because they kind of inform how you manage hydrogen as an energy carrier. It has a lot of energy by unit weight, but because it's such a low density gas, by unit volume, it's low energy density. And, you know, on Earth, although I mentioned, you know, you do occasionally come across seeps with hydrogen, and well, occasionally they are relatively abundant, but most of the hydrogen that we see is within Earth compounds. So, you know, hydrocarbons as an example of that. And then I think a key point here, just to end on this, because when we think about hydrogen, we have to think about how we are actually going to generate the hydrogen. The hydrogen that is used for industry, and I'll touch on its uses, is basically generated. It's processed. So as we think about it as an energy carrier, we also have to think about the value chains, supply chains, to enable hydrogen to actually be separated from existing compounds. So lots of usages for hydrogen. Most of the hydrogen that's currently used today is chemical feedstock. So it's used for creation of ammonia, methanol, desulfurization of hydrocarbons is big usage in refineries for that reason. Also for metallurgy, iron and steel production, glass, and of course rocket propulsion with hydrogen fuels. But the big volumes are being utilized for ammonia desulfurization and methanol. What is developing and where the focus is on hydrogen as a fuel or energy carrier. And here, looking at different schemes, including for fuel cells, for a variety of usages. Turbines, so you can combust hydrogen. You can also utilize it in internal combustion engines. And also the creation of synthetic fuels that are low or no carbon that you can utilize for other purposes. So coming back to this point about energy density, because this is really important, particularly when we think about scaling. So a kilogram, first of all, you have to think about hydrogen, or the way it's commonly referred to, I should say, is in units of mass. When you're transporting it or generating it, you know, you need to think about volume units. But just keep in mind that a kilogram of hydrogen has about the same energy content as a gasoline gallon, all right? And that equates to about 33 kilowatt hours of electrical energy. And if you go to California, you can actually buy hydrogen in retail market. It's about $15 per kilo. So that puts it in reference to whatever you're paying for a gallon of gasoline there, which is probably about $5 or $6 per gallon. Compared to natural gas, and we will focus a lot on natural gas as analog because hydrogen is transported and utilized in its gaseous state. And it has about a third of the energy that natural gas does, that methane does. So this means if you're thinking about hydrogen for energy, you know, power or whatever, you need to think about moving about as 3 times the amount of methane as you would. So the Department of Energy has put together what I think is a really good chart to kind of highlight the varieties of supply, the usages, and the various value chains that you can envision with hydrogen. And why are we excited about hydrogen as part of a future low-carbon economy? Because it offers this flexibility in large part. And let me state up front, the main reason that we're interested in hydrogen is because it does offer a low-carbon energy supply, right? Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be as intrigued about it as we are. But importantly, it's transportable, so you can transport it as a gas. You can liquefy it, although you got to go to minus 250 degrees to do that, so that's costly. But less costly is just forming other compounds, particularly ammonia, that you can move around. It's storable, and this is a really critical point, particularly when you're talking about scaling up hydrogen. You can store it indefinitely, and this is where geology comes in, because potentially, or I should say, not potentially, but the opportunity is to use geological storage for large capacity storage of hydrogen. And then, multiple sources. I'll talk a little bit about the color spectrum that goes with these sources. But you can generate it from electrolysis. You can generate it from natural gas processes, coal, and use nuclear energy for electrolysis and conversion as well. And then lots of different potential usages for this low carbon intensity hydrogen. So what I'm going to do is step through this outline. We're going to start with production and supply, and then we'll go to storage, talk about some of the research, touch on the value chains, and then finish up with alternative sources, and then I'll summarize. So put hydrogen consumption and production into scale. So globally, there's about 70 million metric tons of hydrogen that are produced. And actually, that number that's a couple of years old, I've seen it's gone up to about 90 million currently. And most of that is coming from fossil fuel, with the bulk of that being from natural gas. All right, and the remainder is from coal, primarily in China. And then in the U.S., we have about 10 million metric tons of hydrogen that's being produced, and almost all of that is from fossil fuel. Almost all of that is from natural gas. So just to put this in reference for those folks that may be more comfortable with volumes and units of mass, so that 70 million metric tons is about 30 TCF. So think of that per year. And then 10 million is about 4 TCF of gas. So as you Google, and I hope you do, go on to internet and look up hydrogen, you'll see reference to the color spectrum, the rainbow of hydrogen. I think this has served a purpose. Personally, I think we're kind of beyond this because, I'm literally colorblind, so these colors don't mean all that much to me. But also, I'm kind of agnostic to putting labels onto particular forms of generation or forms of energy. I think we're at a point where we're looking more at carbon intensity, costs, et cetera, and we don't need the labels. But they're out there, they're referred to, and just to touch on a few of these, you'll see green hydrogen. And the reference to green hydrogen is hydrogen that's produced from electrolysis, where the electricity is being supplied from wind, solar, hydro sources. Blue hydrogen, the other one that you'll come across, is one where the hydrogen is being generated from natural gas and has associated carbon capture and storage. Gray is another favorite, and this is basically where most of the hydrogen would be labeled right now. It is natural gas generated through steam reforming processes, and it doesn't have CCS. And then coal gasification would be black or brown. And on this next row, you can kind of see what the qualitative emissions are. So green, no direct CO2 emissions. If you're talking about blue, basically you're looking at up to about 90% capture of the CO2 in those schemes. And then you can get a feeling as to how much CO2 is actually being released with natural gas and also with coal. So cost is a important parameter to look at here. These are some reference costs from the Department of Energy from 2020. These costs are being pushed down, at least for the electrolysis, a little bit. The DOE has put forward a what they call a hydrogen shot target of $1 per kilogram of hydrogen by 2030. Now, if you look over on the left there, you'll see that the fossil fuel technologies are approaching that dollar. Basically we're looking at about $1 to $2 for being able to generate hydrogen, including with CCS, with capturing and storing that hydrogen. The costs of electrolysis are high, but these are coming down. As a matter of fact, I was just looking at a report yesterday. A scheme in Germany looks like which is a fully integrated scheme using wind-powered electrolysis, is down to about $4. So we're going to see these costs come down, but it gives you kind of a feeling, at least, where we currently stand. So talking about some of the technologies, and I'm not going to go into detail in each of these, but it's important to understand how hydrogen is actually being generated. So with steam-methane reforming, and this is where most of the hydrogen is generated, basically it uses steam-methane reforming reaction, which is shown there, and I don't know if I've got laser. But anyway, the first formula, and then also water gas shift. So there are lots and lots of these facilities around the world, including in Texas, and they're supplying hydrogen for industrial uses, most of it being for petrochemical, certainly in Texas and Louisiana, for refining purposes. Coal gasification, that's another scheme. That's kind of a complicated chart there, but it shows how hydrogen can be separated and also utilized for different purposes. But this coal gasification is the main process that is used in China for creation of hydrogen. And they basically heat the coal, or oxidize the coal, you're creating carbon monoxide and hydrogen, and then you also have the shift, create the CO2 and hydrogen. So other places in the world, Australia does this. I don't really know if we have much coal gasification in the U.S., but where there's a lot of coal, this has been certainly a source for hydrogen. Electrolysis. So let me see if I can click on, I don't want to go ahead on this. Charlie, can you help? Yeah, great. So basically the process of electrolysis, and go ahead and click the other one too, we'll get both movies going at the same time, is if you add electricity to water, you at a certain minimum threshold voltage, you can separate the hydrogen from the oxygen. So I'd encourage you all tonight, get a box of salt, put it in a glass of water, just like what I've done here, and, throw in a AA battery, and you'll be generating hydrogen. And so if you see that, if you can put that movie on the right again. So there you can see those little bubbles coming up, and you can see that I can ignite that because that's the hydrogen that's actually being produced. So it's a relatively simple process. There are many technologies that are being applied. The most abundant technologies for electrolysis at industrial scales are alkaline electrolysis and then proton exchange membranes. And I'm not going to go into the details, but basically what you're doing is you're separating the hydrogen. Hydrogen is moving to the cathode in the scheme, and in doing so, you're being able to capture and separate out the hydrogen. All right. And where this comes into play is looking at how you can scale this up for large-scale hydrogen production. And there are schemes. This happens to be a scheme for offshore wind farm. You can do this onshore. Again, any source of electricity can be utilized for electrolysis. But a scheme would be to have an offshore wind farm. You basically are either piping the electrons or piping the hydrogen from offshore into various utilizations, which could be transport, it could be power grid, whatever. We were just briefly touching earlier on nuclear, and one of the schemes that I find really exciting with potential for large-scale hydrogen generation is utilization of what are called small modular nuclear reactors. And these are being tested right now for hydrogen generation purposes up at Idaho National Labs. There's a company, that's NuScale, that's got that, and I think there's another one or two that are also being tested out. And these are small nuclear reactors that you could place anywhere because they're modular. And you could have dedicated energy being utilized for hydrogen generation from these reactors. And this scheme can generate 2 tons of kilogram per hour, or 50 metric tons per day per a 250 megawatt plant, which is relatively small, but it allows you to replicate this and scale up. So lots of different ways that we can generate hydrogen. And with particularly thinking about electrolysis from renewables or nuclear, these are very low carbon intensity schemes. All right, now let's get to some of the geology. It's why you guys are here. When we started getting into hydrogen, this is a couple of years ago, what really was interesting us at the Bureau is, okay, well, how does this compare with our natural gas systems? And again, thinking about scaling up, what are we going to have to do to be able to address hydrogen, large-scale hydrogen production utilization in the future? So the chart on the right is a map of the U.S. natural gas system and showing all the storage locations. You'll see another version of that. But it's important to point out that we move or produce, move, and utilize a huge amount of energy in the form of natural gas every day. So these are 2019 figures. It's gone up a little bit since then, but about 85 billion cubic feet of natural gas is being consumed in the U.S. And there's another 11 or 12 BCF that's now being exported in the form of LNG. So, on the order of 94, 95 BCF that's actually being produced. Thanks to shales, by the way, for the large part, but also the offshore and conventional reservoirs. What's important in these schemes is that we're able to get this gas from production to market by this pipeline system, but part of that infrastructure includes storage. So the U.S. has about enough storage for essentially 13% of the annual supply. And that'll vary a little bit, but that's a working gas storage, so this gas is actually moving around, not staying in the reservoir. So that compares with the current storage capacity in the Gulf Coast, where we actually do have underground storage for hydrogen that's being utilized predominantly for petrochemical refining purposes. And so there are 3 sites in salt domes, and I'll describe that a little bit more, where we have roughly 6 BCF. It would vary, but between 5 and 8 BCF of hydrogen storage. So if we want to think about a large-scale system for hydrogen, then we need to be thinking about how we're going to scale up storage. And just bring this point home, and not to disparage electrochemical batteries, they definitely have their role. But the great thing about molecular energy, hydrogen in this case, is you have a lot of energy there. And if you look at, at least as of last year, with the largest lithium-ion battery complex in the world, I'm sure it's been surpassed by now, but that offers about 1.2 gigawatt hours of storage. The problem with electrochemical batteries is you have limited duration of storage. So this gets you through, let's say, diurnal cycles. You get about 4 hours. So it's great for balancing loads on a daily basis. It's not so great for storage. For example, you know, with the big Texas chill a couple of years ago, batteries wouldn't have helped out. So you compare that with what would be a small hydrogen storage underground facility, and this would be a very small one, a little more than a BCF of storage, and you have 100 gigawatt hours of energy. So it means that, particularly for things like backup power, but you know, we're talking about literally a couple of orders of magnitude in storage potential, with the ability to store it indefinitely. So with that, we have delved into the work on, okay, you know, where can we store hydrogen? What are the potential reservoirs, areas that it could be stored? How does that relate to what we know from the U.S. natural gas system and the storage facilities there? And basically, we're looking at 3 types of storage. One is within salt deposits, mainly in salt domes, but it could also be in embedded salt as well. Utilization of depleted oil and gas fields, as well as looking at saline aquifers. So in other words, where you don't have a former container for hydrocarbons, but you know you got a trap and you could use it for gas storage. What's important in this is the geology, fundamentally, but also having a broad geographic coverage if you want to have a system that's going to be functional over a large area. So, and we need to be thinking about, in the case of hydrogen, where is the hydrogen going to be generated? Are you going to be using wind from West Texas, let's say, and moving it to a market in Eastern Texas? Where is the end-use sites like that I just said? You know, is it Texas, if you're thinking about a Texas system? Is it elsewhere? And also the infrastructure for transportation. So, you know, we have gone into looking at, all right, these options in some detail. And just to say a little bit more on the storage facilities for natural gas. So for those who are maybe working on storage, and I don't know if there are any in the audience right now, but you know, we've got a long history. It's about 100 years or more of storing natural gas and oil and products, hydrocarbon products in underground storage reservoirs. So, and basically these are split by type there and also by capacity for natural gas here. Most of the storage in the U.S. is in depleted oil and gas fields. There is some in aquifers. Again, depending on the geology, if you don't have a depleted field, you may have to look at an aquifer for a given location, and some in salt domes. And this really reflects the geological options that we have across the lower 48, right? So if you're in the Gulf Coast or West Texas or maybe a few other areas, parts of Utah, Montana, North Dakota, you have options for salt, including the Michigan Basin and the North Central Appalachian region. Elsewhere, you may have some depleted fields that you can use, and elsewhere you may have some just aquifers. And there are certain areas where you just don't have good, and what I mean by good is relatively low cost geological storage opportunities. So that just tells you, that relates to where the types of storage actually have arisen. The great thing about geological storage is capacity. And this is a chart just comparing the amount of capacity, and this is in metric tons on the y-axis, for surface options. So you can think about these, cylindrical or spherical containers on the surface for hydrogen storage versus what you can get with, let's say, typical geological storage. And again, we're talking, in this case, actually several orders of magnitude increase in capacity with geological options. So that tells you a little bit of why the geology is important, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail there. But just to give you a feeling, okay, I've been talking about low carbon economy where hydrogen fits. So where does it actually, what are the projections? Well, there's a big range of projections. You may struggle to see the details, but one is a set from the Hydrogen Council, which is, as you might think, very bullish in hydrogen, which would get to 660 million metric tons by 2050. Exxon's projection last year was just a little bit of additional hydrogen production. Shell, all these companies put out their projections on this, and since I'm former Shell, maybe I'm focused on this a little bit more. But basically, they carry a range between a low of roughly 250 or so million metric tons by 2050 to a high of almost 700 million metric tons. So there's a real broad range. But if you look at the numbers, these are important. So the low is about 80 TCF of hydrogen gas. The high would equate to about 300 TCF. So it's a lot. So if we think about this in terms of storage and the amount of gas that would be needed, now we're using some data from the Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Energy Association with looking just at the US alone. And they have a base 2050 model. They have an ambitious model. And then what we've done is just gone in and back calculated, well, how about if we just assume that we'd replace about 10% of the natural gas utilization with hydrogen? What would that mean? And that means about 14 trillion cubic feet of hydrogen. The orange bars there are showing the amount of storage, assuming about 13% storage capacity on an annual basis for that amount of hydrogen. So they're just highlighting the storage that would be required. In this case, kind of a middle of the road case, 10%. And it's a lot of storage. And I say that because now focusing on this 10% case, what does this actually mean? And for those that are early in your careers and thinking about future, well, have a good look at these numbers. So this is what I would say a very modest projection of storage requirements for the US. And if you look at this 10% case, you're needing to have more than 1,100 salt caverns. You're needing to have more than 200 depleted fields just to account for that hydrogen that would be stored, assuming about the same capacity requirement for storage as natural gas, which is, I think, actually a pretty modest expectation. My guess is we're going to need a lot more than just 13% for hydrogen systems. So we need a lot of storage, is the point here. And this steps us into the research components. So when I mentioned that salt caverns are currently being utilized for hydrogen storage in Texas. There's also a facility in the United Kingdom called Teesside, where a small amount of hydrogen is being stored in salt. So we know that we can store hydrogen in salt without too many issues. The problem, as you saw from the geological maps in the US at least, is, and this equates to the same point globally, is you're not necessarily blessed or endowed with salt deposits everywhere in the globe. You also have to mine these. Basically, it's dissolution process to mine them, and I'll share a little bit more about that with you. And you know, so there's still some work to understand how these different kinds of salt are going to behave, how heterogeneous they are, and you know, can you go out there and just use any salt dome to create a cavern? So, but anyway, that's fairly advanced with technical readiness. The big questions are with the depleted oil and gas fields and saline aquifers for hydrogen, because there we just don't have the experience. And because of the potential of issues with leakage, issues with reaction in the reservoir, either with minerals or existing fluids, we need to go out there and really get some hard data to understand how these are going to, these types of reservoirs are going to work for hydrogen storage. The good thing about these is that it opens up a very broad range of geographic coverage for storage opportunities. So part of our research, and I think Sue is going to talk next, we've got a scheme on CCS for the offshore Texas from her group, but it's looking at where we have pore space, where do we have reservoirs, how can we characterize these reservoirs, and to be able to evaluate what would be the optimum storage facilities for hydrogen going forward. And also, we may have to make some choices. Are we going to use that pore space for carbon sequestration, or are we going to use that carbon or that pore space for hydrogen storage? And in some cases, you know, we may want to have linked systems. So we need to be able to do this evaluation and conduct the research so we can get a much better idea of what the optimal sites are. I mentioned salt caverns a couple of times, and this is just a fairly simple schematic showing what a salt dome looks like, and a cavern with a typical dimension, about 2,000 feet tall, a couple hundred feet in diameter. And the issue here is that even with natural gas systems or oil, you can have a lot of heterogeneities in these salt systems. And that can create problems, and particularly integrity problems are a big issue. So we need to better understand the types of salt and the specifics of any given location before we're putting a lot of hydrogen into these. And that just gives you a comparison of what we're talking about in terms of scale. So Empire State Building for reference there. So as I mentioned, we have 3 facilities and domes for hydrogen storage, 3 domes, Clemens, Moss Bluff, and Spindletop, equating to between 5 and 8 BCF of hydrogen storage is currently being utilized right now. We have lots of other storage sites in salt across the Gulf Coast used for natural gas as well as oil, including the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which has been in the news relatively recently. There's one dome called Big Hill, which is being utilized by that. We've been talking with that group a little bit. And then in addition to the domal salt bodies, you also have in West Texas the potential for bedded salt. So in other words, where the salt hasn't mobilized, and when I say salt, I'm talking about halite here, where halite has not mobilized, basically flatline, you still go in and dissolve relatively small caverns, use those for storage. So now focusing on porous media, so sandstones or carbonates, whatever, you know, the real big questions here from a research perspective, as I mentioned, is leakage. You know, hydrogen is a really small molecule. Are you going to be able to keep it there? The fluid-rock interactions, also how the hydrogen can be injected in, where's it going to go? Are you going to produce it all back? And looking at other gas-gas and gas-brine reactions. So our research is focused on that. One just touch point, this chart right here shows microbes. And one point to note, we're not doing that work here at Bureau UT, is that hydrogen at certain reservoir conditions can be eaten by microbes. And in doing so, it actually will generate methane. And so you can have a loss of product if you have a lot of the microbes that are out there consuming your hydrogen. So it's one point where a few laboratories or research units are having a look at. So I want to talk just a little bit about how hydrogen behaves in the subsurface. I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail here, but we've the good thing is that we do a lot of simulations, and we can effectively modify our static models by incorporating hydrogen and be able to compare how hydrogen would behave versus natural gas or CO2 in these reservoirs. So this is just showing, or making the point about mobility. Hydrogen is extremely mobile, and because it is much less dense and much less viscous than methane. So it behaves differently than natural gas. And Dr. Delshad here at UT has part of our team and has done some analysis with simulation. She's done a lot more than this, but this is just a great example. It's from a model of a field, existing field in northern Colorado, where you've got a dome, which you can see with the orthographic projections. And then we've looked at how methane or natural gas can be injected and retained in this, where it goes versus hydrogen. And what you see, because of the much higher mobility of hydrogen, that hydrogen will actually disperse. So you get saturations that are extending down into, this is a high permeability channel that crosses the domal part of the field, and that some of that hydrogen is being moved off into those high permeability zones because of its low mobility. You also, because we have pressure limits on how much we can pressure up these reservoirs, can only hold about 2/3 of the volume of gas in this reservoir for hydrogen that you would be able to do with natural gas. And you get different behaviors with how you inject it and produce it. So, this is pretty fundamental type of work, and we're building up a portfolio of analysis so that we can start to get at which types of reservoirs, which types of systems are best suited for hydrogen. I guess I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but just to emphasize that natural gas and hydrogen are different. And so we can't just assume that if we've got a storage facility that's being utilized for natural gas right now, with our limited understanding, that we're going to be able to use that for hydrogen. We think so, but we need to address these issues. And one of the big questions here comes down to some of the regulatory frameworks, public acceptance, et cetera. There's going to need to be a lot of engagement around storing hydrogen in a field, let's say, that's close to town X. All right, so moving on. So the research is important, and this all plays into understanding value chains. So ultimately, either with incentives, government incentives, or without, hopefully without down the road, there needs to be a way to be able to create value from utilization of hydrogen and energy systems. And so part of our research is just trying to get at what these value chains are and where does storage fit into this? So how can you optimize these value chains with consideration of geological storage in particular, as well as if you're thinking about using fossil fuels as the basis for your hydrogen generation, where are you going to put the carbon? Where are you going to put the CO2 with CCS? So all these are interlinked, and fundamentally you need to have this big picture so you can really get at the specific components of these value chains. And then it also informs the geographies that you could utilize. And do you have storage? Do you have the potential for generation? And also, where are the end usages that you're envisioning? So, I've just thrown a couple up there. Power is one potential utilization. You can think of this as backup for a grid. Heavy transport trucks seems to be a winner these days in consideration of hydrogen utilization. But probably what's getting the most attention is hard to abate large-scale industrial usages, where it's just difficult to think how you can go about electrifying those. So hydrogen is a critical solution for those. And this is just another scheme, but given I'm talking to some geologists or geoscientists here, it's, I think, really important to put in context, and also will relate a little bit to what I'm sure Sue will talk about next talk, which is when you're talking about either schemes, with green, so coming from renewable generation, wind or solar, or with blue from natural gas, specifically in this case, you need to be thinking of what your options are for storage. And also for blue, what are your options not only for storing the hydrogen, but also for CO2 sequestration? And how do those link to the usage and where the market is and where you're generating? So we've got a lot of work ongoing here. There's a lot of company interest in particular about putting together these pieces in such a way that they can make a business, a functional business out of this. And if you look at Texas, we're blessed. You guys, 5 minutes? We're just absolutely blessed with lots of resources here. And we've got solar, we've got wind, we have a bunch of natural gas, and all this can factor into potential generation and we also have some infrastructure in transportation of that hydrogen to markets. So hydrogen is a key opportunity for Texas in general. And we are doing a lot of work looking at how we can make this opportunity real for companies, communities in Texas, and as well as the federal and state government. Okay, so I would be remiss if I just didn't touch on a couple of other points with regards to alternative sources. And I'd mentioned, hydrogen seeps. So, if you go to seeps, you can go to Turkey, Mid-Atlantic Ridge, you'll find some percentage of hydrogen in those seeps. So we actually are generating hydrogen from the earth, and it's fusing out in various forms in various locations. And these are just reported occurrences. So globally, we've had occurrences here. The question, and this has come up recently with a lot of focus, are there economically viable accumulations of native hydrogen? So rather than having to go out and synthesize it or generate it, can we go and find it? So you need to think a little bit about the origins of hydrogen from the earth. And we know one process for sure works with serpentinization. So if you have ultramafics, olivine is an example here, you can combine that with water under certain PT conditions and actually generate hydrogen through the mineral transformation. There's other sources. I mentioned biological activity. That's one way to do it. Yeah, organic matter, very high maturities. You can generate hydrogen from coal or other source rocks. And so many options, but those questions are really fundamental. Can you concentrate it at high percentages? Can you trap it? Can it be preserved? And overall, can you actually go explore and produce and make it economic? And just realize that you're going to have to be able to produce it at about $1 per kilo hydrogen equivalent. So this is a scheme coming out of CSIRO at in Australia. Chris Borum put this together, but just to kind of highlight, what the potential sources and traps are. I would just make the point that I only know one example of a significant trapped hydrogen accumulation. That's in Mali, and I'll show a slide on that. There are just an absence of hydrogen accumulations, and we've drilled millions of wells over the last 150 years. So we just haven't encountered a lot of hydrogen. And this is an example from Mali. It was, Beverly Hillbillies sort of scheme. They're drilling a water well. The water well exploded, and because they had a pocket of hydrogen. And it was relatively shallow, a couple hundred meters depth, and it's relatively unique geology. You have Proterozoic sandstones and dolerite sills, or Triassic dolerite sills that are acting as seals here. But you have an accumulation. It's about 6 square kilometers of area, but it's very, very low pressure. It's on the order of about 50 psi. So that's bicycle tube pressure. So it's great for the community, but it's not a big export. Last point is, and some of our research has been focused on, okay, well, you can actually generate hydrogen from oil fields in situ. And back in the 1980s, BP was doing some work in the tar sands of western Alberta. They're playing around with in situ combustion, which is the process where you basically use a combination of air, wet oxygen, wet meaning steam in this case, inject it, you start combustion, and the syngas, the synthetic gas that's produced, had about 20% or higher hydrogen content. So this kind of opens the door for being able to take an existing oil field, and rather than producing oil from it, you use it to generate hydrogen. And then you'd need to sequester the CO2. There's some schemes being developed about trying to do that downhole. And then you could separate the CO2 and produce a hydrogen. So there are a couple of companies active in this front. There's one in Calgary called Proton, and another one in Sweden that are pursuing this work. So we'll see. So with that, I'll just finish up. I'm not going to step through all these, but hopefully you got an overview of the hydrogen value chains, why hydrogen is getting interest from folks that are concerned about carbonization and thinking about decarbonization solutions, and more importantly, where geology fits into this. So, I firmly believe that this is going to be part of a geologist's future in the next 5 years. Well, it is now. It's part of my future. But this is going to develop, and focus on hydrogen storage is going to be a burgeoning industry. So with that, I'll stop. Take any questions you might have. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Early on, the U.S. has natural gas storage capacity of 13% of its annual consumption.
Yeah.